The evening shift at Moonlight Diner was usually uneventful. A humble establishment on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, it was a place where locals stopped by for a warm slice of pecan pie and bottomless cups of coffee. The dim lights, vintage decor, and faded red booths gave it a nostalgic charm that seemed frozen in time. For Laura, a 33-year-old waitress, it was her second home, a steady job that paid the bills and gave her a sense of routine. Most of the customers were regulars, construction workers, retirees, and college students who dropped in for a late-night meal. Laura knew their names, their orders, even their quirks. But tonight, the familiar rhythm of clinking cups and low murmurs was interrupted when a black man in his mid-30s walked in. He wore a dark hoodie, pulled up over his head, obscuring most of his face. His jeans were worn, his sneakers scuffed. He didn't seem like a typical diner customer. Laura stiffened as her eyes locked onto him. Something about his casual stride and confident demeanor unsettled her. He scanned the room, eventually settling into a booth in the corner, far from the other patrons. Laura glanced at the counter where the diner's owner, Mr. Riggs, stood cleaning a stack of plates. He raised an eyebrow at her as if to say, "Your table." Taking a deep breath, Laura grabbed her notepad and approached the man. "Evening," she said, forcing a polite smile. "What can I get you?" The man looked up, his face now partially visible. There was something striking about his eyes, sharp, intense, as though they were sizing up the world. "Just a coffee," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Black." Laura hesitated for a second longer than she meant to. She scribbled on her notepad, then added, "Anything else?" He shook his head. "That'll be all, thank you." She walked back to the counter, feeling uneasy. "Who do you think he is?" she muttered to Mr. Riggs as she poured the coffee. "Doesn't seem like the usual crowd." Mr. Riggs shrugged. "Doesn't matter, does it? A customer's a customer." Laura frowned. She wasn't so sure. Something about the man's presence had stirred up whispers among the other patrons. A few of the regulars were casting sidelong glances at his booth, muttering under their breath. As Laura carried the steaming mug to the man's table, she caught snippets of their conversation. Words like troublemaker and up to no good floated through the air. Setting the coffee down, Laura couldn't help but blurt out, "We don't get a lot of new faces around here." The man glanced up at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I can tell." Her cheeks flushed, realizing how her comment might have sounded. "I didn't mean—" she started, but he cut her off. "It's fine," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm just passing through." Laura nodded awkwardly and stepped away, but she couldn't shake the tension in the room. The whispers grew louder. One of the regulars, a burly man named Chuck, leaned over to his friend and said, "What's a guy like that doing here? Probably casing the place." Laura's stomach churned. She didn't agree with Chuck's comment, but she also didn't speak up. Instead, she busied herself behind the counter, trying to ignore the growing unease. Minutes later, the bell above the door chimed again. This time, a man in a gray hoodie entered, his face partially obscured. Laura's heart skipped a beat when she recognized him. It was Elon Musk. She had seen his face countless times on the news, social media, and even in the diner's old magazines. But seeing him in person, in their little diner, was surreal. The room fell silent as Elon walked in, exuding an unassuming confidence. He glanced around before choosing a booth directly across from the black man. As he sat down, he pulled the hood of his sweatshirt down, revealing his unmistakable face. Laura froze. What were the odds? Two high-profile moments in one night. She quickly grabbed a menu and approached his table, her hands trembling slightly. "Welcome to Moonlight Diner," she said, her voice barely steady. "Can I get you anything?" Elon looked up, his expression neutral but kind. "Just a coffee, and whatever pie you recommend." "Coming right up," Laura said, her pulse racing. She rushed to the counter, almost bumping into Mr. Riggs. "Is that who I think it is?" he whispered. Laura nodded. "It's Elon Musk. He's sitting right across from, that guy." Mr. Riggs's eyes widened. "What's he doing here?" "No idea," Laura replied. "But this night just got a lot more interesting." As she prepared Elon's order, she noticed the black man glancing at him. Elon, in turn, seemed to acknowledge him with a slight nod. There was an unspoken connection between the two, one that Laura couldn't quite place. When she delivered Elon's coffee and pie, she couldn't resist asking, "So, what brings you here?" Elon smiled faintly. "Sometimes you need to step away from the noise," he said cryptically. Laura nodded, pretending to understand. As she turned to leave, she overheard Chuck muttering again, this time louder. "What's the world coming to? First him," he gestured toward the black man. "And now Musk? What's next, a celebrity circus?" Laura's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She wanted to tell Chuck to keep his voice down, but before she could, Elon stood up and walked over to the black man's booth. The diner fell silent again as he extended a hand. "Mind if I join you?" Elon asked. The man looked up surprised, but after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Go ahead." As Elon slid into the booth, Chuck scoffed audibly. "Figures," he muttered. The two men began talking in low voices, their conversation inaudible to the rest of the diner. Laura watched from behind the counter, her curiosity piqued. What could they possibly be discussing? It wasn't every day that Elon Musk struck up a conversation with a stranger in a roadside diner. The murmurs among the patrons grew louder. Some were excited, others suspicious. Laura couldn't ignore the growing tension. Finally, she worked up the courage to approach their table, pretending to check on their orders. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice tentative. Elon looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Everything's fine," he said. Then after a pause, he added, "Actually, maybe not." Laura's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Elon gestured toward the other patrons. "It seems like there's a lot of judgment in this room tonight." Laura's face flushed. She glanced around, seeing the glares and whispers aimed at the black man, and now at Elon. I'm sorry about that," she stammered. "They're not usually like this." Elon studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing. "Sometimes it takes one person to change the tone of a room," he said softly. Laura didn't know how to respond. She felt a knot of shame tightening in her chest. Had she contributed to the negativity by staying silent? By letting Chuck's comments go unchecked? As the conversation between Elon and the man continued, Laura found herself listening intently, hoping to understand what had brought them together. She didn't know it yet, but this encounter was about to change her life in ways she never expected. The tension in Moonlight Diner hung thick in the air. Laura returned to the counter, her mind racing as she watched Elon Musk and the black man across the room. Their conversation, though too low to hear, seemed serious. Every so often, Elon would gesture with his hands, leaning forward with a look of earnest intent. Chuck, still seated with his buddies, snorted loudly. "Can you believe this?" he said, his voice carrying through the diner. "A billionaire, and some random nobody sitting there like they've got the world to fix. What a joke." Laura clenched her fists. She wasn't one to make waves, but Chuck's words grated on her nerves. Before she could respond, Elon stood up. The room went silent as he walked toward the counter, his expression calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the entire diner now. "I couldn't help but notice the, lively commentary." Chuck folded his arms, smirking. "Just calling it how I see it." Elon tilted his head, as if considering Chuck's words. "Interesting. And how do you see it exactly?" Chuck leaned back in his seat, clearly enjoying the attention. "I see someone like you," he gestured at Elon, "trying to play savior. And him over there," he added with a nod toward the black man, "probably looking for a handout. Am I wrong?" A few patrons chuckled uncomfortably. Laura's heart sank. She could see the black man shift slightly in his seat, his jaw tightening. Elon didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a small, measured smile that carried no humor. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, "but it's also wrong." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, enlighten us." Elon took a deep breath and glanced around the room, his gaze settling on each person for a moment before continuing. "The man sitting at that table," he began, "is Dr. Marcus Bell. He's a physicist, a professor, and one of the most brilliant minds I've had the privilege of working with. He's not here for a handout. He's here because we're discussing a project that could change lives. Your lives." The diner fell silent. Chuck's smirk faltered. Elon pressed on, his voice steady but impassioned. Dr. Bell is working on clean energy solutions that could make power more affordable for communities like this one. He's the kind of person who looks at a problem and asks, how can I fix it? And yet, when he walks into a room, people like you, Elon's gaze landed squarely on Chuck, make assumptions. Why? Chuck shifted uncomfortably. I, I didn't know who he was. That's the problem, isn't it? Elon said, his tone sharper now. You didn't bother to know. You judged him based on how he looked, not who he is. The room was so quiet that Laura could hear her own heartbeat. She felt a lump in her throat as Elon's words sank in. And as for me, Elon continued, I came here to get away from the noise, to find a quiet place to think. But instead, I walked into a room full of whispers and assumptions. He glanced toward Laura, his eyes softening. Not everyone here judged. Some people saw what was happening and stayed silent because they were afraid of standing out. But sometimes silence is just as loud as the words being spoken. Laura's cheeks burned. She knew he was talking about her. Elon turned back to Chuck. You asked me to enlighten you, so here it is. The world doesn't change when people like me build rockets or invent new technology. It changes when people like you, everyday people, decide to be better, to think before they speak, to treat others with respect. Chuck didn't respond. He looked down at his plate, his bravado crumbling under Elon's steady gaze. Dr. Bell stood up then, his voice calm but firm. For what it's worth, he said, addressing the room, I've dealt with people like you my whole life, and while it's disappointing, it's not surprising. But I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here because I believe that even people like you deserve access to clean energy and better opportunities. That's what I'm working toward, whether you appreciate it or not. The patrons stared at him, their expressions a mix of shame and curiosity. Elon looked at Laura again. And you, he said gently, you had a choice. You could have joined in the judgment, but you didn't. I noticed that. Laura swallowed hard. I should have spoken up sooner, she admitted. Maybe, Elon said, but recognizing your mistakes is the first step toward doing better. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Handing it to her, he said, I'm always looking for people who are willing to learn, grow, and stand up for what's right. If you're interested, give me a call. Laura stared at the card, her hands trembling. I don't know what to say. Elon smiled. Just think about it. With that, he and Dr. Bell walked out of the diner, leaving behind a room full of stunned patrons. The next day, Laura couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The card sat on her bedside table, a tangible reminder of the chance Elon Musk had given her. When she walked into the diner for her next shift, the atmosphere was different. The regulars were quieter, more subdued. Even Chuck kept his head down, barely saying a word. As Laura wiped down the counter, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't had before. Elon's words echoed in her mind. The world changes when everyday people decide to be better. That night, she made a decision. Picking up the phone, she dialed the number on the card. Hello? Came a voice on the other end. This is Laura, she said, her voice steady. I'm ready to do better. And with that, her life took a new direction, one she never could have imagined.